Some houses are bigger, more open, and certainly more expensive than the homes that came before them. But I'm not always convinced they feel better to live in. And while flipping through this old book of California bungalows, I found a house that surprised me. When I first saw this plan, I assumed the story of this video would be pretty straightforward. It was a 100-year-old house. It had no garage, it had small closets, separated rooms, and all the compromises we usually associate with older homes. I figured I would recreate it, identify what no longer worked, and begin redesigning it for modern life. But the longer I spent with this house, the stranger that assumption became. This book is called California Bungalows of the Twenties, and this particular design is listed as floor plan number 394.5-A. The footprint measures 44 by 38 feet, and according to the book, the estimated construction cost at that time was $1,800. Now, obviously, that number belongs to another world entirely, and I'm not bringing it up to compare prices or argue that houses used to be easier or cheaper to build. What interests me is what that number says about the ambition of this project itself. This house was never trying to be a mansion. It was intended to be comfortable, practical, and attainable, and that caught my attention. So let's sketch it out. At first glance, the layout feels surprisingly clear and easy to understand. The living room anchors the front of the house, the dining room sits directly behind it, and the kitchen stays more quietly toward the rear while the bedrooms occupy their own side of the plan. And this is where I expected the friction to begin. Because usually when I look at the older houses, there are moments where modern expectations start pushing back. Maybe circulation feels awkward, maybe rooms don't connect very well, or maybe the plan starts fighting the way people live today. So I started sketching and asking those questions. I was thinking about things like making an ensuite for the bedrooms, pushing out the exterior of the house to add a private bathroom and closet and all that stuff. I was also thinking, maybe I should expand the kitchen or add a den area or a game room. And all these things made the building change in my mind. I started wondering, should the rooms just generally be larger? Was there some major adjustment hiding in the plan that would eventually become obvious? At first, I assumed yes, because that's usually the story. But something unexpected started happening. Every time I sketched a change, I found myself hesitating. Not because the house was perfect, far from it, but because I wasn't convinced the changes actually improved it or made it better. And that was the first surprise. I kept waiting for the moment where the design would clearly announce what needed fixing, and it just never quite happened for me. This happens quite a lot professionally in the design world when we think we have better ideas for something that maybe already works, and we keep throwing different ideas at it and seeing if something sticks. And sometimes you may have spent all this time sketching and coming up with new ideas just to throw it away, but you do have to go through that process to know whether it works or not. Once I moved into modeling this in Revit, I assumed that perhaps the real problems would reveal themselves once the walls were standing in 3 dimensions and I could start to really see it. Sometimes a plan can read beautifully on paper and feel entirely different once it becomes actual space. But once again, that moment never really arrived for me. The living room felt sheltered and comfortable. The dining room connected naturally. And the kitchen stayed present without becoming the center of the entire house. And I found myself slowing down. At some point I realized I wasn't redesigning the house anymore. I was just really studying it. Of course, there were differences from what many people expect today. The closets are smaller, there's no attached garage, there's no large primary suite with a spa-like bathroom, and some rooms could certainly be bigger. But those increasingly felt like changes in lifestyle and expectation rather than failures in planning. And somewhere around this point, I realized something slightly uncomfortable. I wasn't really trying to redesign the house anymore. I was trying to understand why I didn't want to. I grew up in Southern California, surrounded by arts and crafts and craftsman houses, green and green stuff, the Gamble house I got to visit when I was in grad school, and these California bungalows. They were often designed more around the comfort and everyday life rather than like a display. And maybe that's part of what I was responding to here. The house wasn't trying to impress me, it was just simply trying to work well. There were some moments where I decided to make a slight change from this plan. Like, this bedroom originally appeared to have a direct door leading to the front porch, and at first my instinct was to remove it. Privacy felt more important, and the opening initially seemed unnecessary. But the longer I sat with that decision, the less certain I became. Because if this room became an office, a guest room, or some kind of creative space, direct porch access suddenly starts sounding pretty appealing. And maybe that became a recurring theme throughout this project. The things I assumed I would dislike often started making more sense once I spent more time with them. So I'm kind of curious, would you keep the porch door or would you get rid of it? And then we arrive at something I still don't fully understand. Because the screened porch originally had a dedicated toilet room tucked into the corner. I removed it and added the area to the second bedroom closet, but I still feel like I may be missing something. Was this like a practical thing or was it regional? Was this more common than I realized? And this is where the project shifted for me. The question was no longer whether this house still worked, because for the most part it clearly did. The question became why we stopped building homes like this in the first place. And I don't mean that rhetorically or nostalgically. Maybe the answer's cars and garages became essential. Maybe larger furniture changed room proportions. Maybe kitchens became more social and central to family life. Maybe air conditioning even changed the way we relate to porches and windows. Or maybe our expectations simply shifted. Because somewhere along the way, homes began prioritizing different things. More openness, more visibility, and more square footage, often for very good reasons. But I do wonder whether some of that came at the expense of something harder to describe. Many of these homes were designed with built-ins, porches, and smaller but more intentional rooms. They weren't necessarily trying to maximize everything. They were often trying to shape daily life in a particular way. Maybe that's part of what feels different here. One detail in this book that made me smile, it mentions that reverse plans can be ordered for $10, which means even 100 years ago, people were already customizing houses to fit their lot and lifestyle. Maybe stock plans are not quite as modern as we think. And I like that reminder because these homes were never sacred objects frozen in time. They were adjusted and adapted to real life just like houses today. And this is where the house really started feeling alive. I especially love the built-ins in the living room. And the original plan actually included a designated place for a piano between the shelves. These details made me stop for a second, because I only know like one family that still has a piano in their house. But maybe your experience is different. I ended up placing these like cushions here because furniture blocked the window, but I'm not convinced the solution really works. So I don't know, what would you do? Would you keep the piano idea? Maybe like a reading nook, fill it with plants? Maybe do it something totally different. I suspect this little corner says quite a lot about how life at home has changed. And then the house challenged me one more time. After I finished the kitchen, I realized I had tucked the sink deeper into the room. Later, when I looked back at the original plan, I noticed something I had missed. The sink was intended to face the window. And the more I thought about it, the more sense that made. Doing dishes may not be glamorous, but if you're going to spend time there anyways, looking outside feels far better than staring at a wall. I appreciated that moment because it reminded me that older houses still have things to teach us. So what I appreciated most about this house is its restraint. It doesn't feel desperate to impress anybody. The rooms feel sheltered and connected without becoming overly open. The porch feels like part of everyday life, and the living room manages to feel cozy without being cramped. I also found myself appreciating the separation between spaces more than I expected. The kitchen can remain messy while the dining room still feels intentional, and the living room remains a place to gather rather than an extension of every other function of the house. And maybe that's where this project surprised me the most. I started out assuming that openness and modernity would naturally improve the house, but somewhere along the way I realized I wasn't trying to make it more modern anymore. I was just trying to understand why it already felt so comfortable. And maybe comfort is the real word here. Not perfection or nostalgia, just comfort. The kind that comes from rooms that feel scaled to people and spaces having their own identity and purpose. I started this project assuming the real story would be how much needed to change. Instead, I found myself resisting change more than I expected, and that surprised me. Not because old automatically means better, and not because we should stop designing modern homes, but because a small bungalow made me wonder whether some of our priorities really shifted along the way. Maybe we traded certain comforts for others. Maybe we gained flexibility and openness while losing some intimacy and enclosure. Or maybe I'm completely wrong, so I'm curious what you think. Would this house still work for you today? And if not, what changed? Thanks for coming along with me on this. Stay curious and design with intent.